More than 5 million Americans suffer from something called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. That's the topic of the next Healthy Living coming up next. Welcome to Healthy Living. I'm your host, Tammy Thompson. On this edition of the program, we're going to be discussing post-traumatic stress disorder, a disorder that plagues more than 5 million Americans and more than 10% of the population. And we're here talking with a local psychologist and contact provider for the Federal Vet Center, Dr. Gordon Williams.
Hi,
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
I did some research on this. You hear all kinds of things about post-traumatic stress disorder and what it entails and what it is, and I brought you here because I want you to really kind of explain to our audience what it is and who suffers from it, to give them a little bit of better idea of how it plagues many people more than I even knew. Mm-hmm. So what is post-traumatic stress disorder?
Well, I think an interesting way of describing post-traumatic stress disorder is to begin with a quote that German psychiatrist Viktor Frankl once made in his book, The Search for Meaning. And what the quote that Frankl made in that book was, an abnormal response to an abnormal situation is normal behavior. So post-traumatic stress disorder, what happens, people have been exposed to an abnormal set of circumstances. They then begin to react with what to others looks as though it's abnormal symptoms or abnormal behavior. But if you take it in the fuller context of the initial abnormal trauma, it's a very normal reaction. So that's something that needs to be kept in mind when you talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. It's officially called one of the psychiatric anxiety disorders, but it's really not a psychiatric disorder in that it will happen to anyone, any normal individual who finds himself or herself in an abnormal traumatic situation will develop the symptoms of PTSD. And I think that's very important to keep in mind. Mm-hmm. It can happen to anyone. If one is exposed to a life-threatening situation, or if one is a family member of someone who is exposed to a life-threatening situation, then an individual is quite likely to develop the various symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So
to the outsider looking in, they look very abnormal.
Yes.
And people, well, they're crazy. You've heard people say, well, they're just crazy. There's something wrong with those people. But it's like you said, it's very normal considering what's going on inside of them.
Yes.
To what they've been exposed to.
Yes, and that's what's so important to keep in mind, because if someone has this type of a problem, has post-traumatic stress disorder, there's still a lot of stereotypes and there's a lot of biases out there in society about, well, you're not supposed to seek any type of help if you have something wrong with your nerves. But when you look at this particular problem, again, it's something that happens to very normal people who have been exposed to an abnormal set of circumstances. And I stress that over and over again. I work with a large number of people who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Many veterans from the various wars. I work with policemen, firemen, people in various industrial positions who have been hurt, airline pilots, you name it. Anybody, depending upon their situation in life, who finds himself in a life-threatening traumatic situation will develop these problems.
So those are the type of people who experience it. You talked about the rescue workers, particularly the workers from September 11th in Washington, D.C. and New York City and the Oklahoma City bombing.
Yes.
And those are the high-profile cases that you would expect people to have.
Yes.
But they're more grassroots kind of things, abuse victims?
Very definitely, very definitely. Anyone who's in an abusive situation in the home setting can end up with post-traumatic stress symptoms. People who unfortunately are robbed, one-time events such as a robbery or a raping, can lead to post-traumatic stress symptoms. Just everyday people out there trying to live their lives, and then something terribly out of the ordinary that's momentarily life-threatening occurs, and individuals can end up with post-traumatic stress disorder. So, as you say, the graphic examples are people who have been away at war, are victims of 9/11, but it can happen to anyone, and it does.
How about children?
Children are very susceptible to post-traumatic stress disorder. I've treated a number of youngsters in the office who had post-traumatic stress disorder. Youngsters who have been bitten by animals, they develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Some youngsters who see a lot of abuse in their families develop the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. It's certainly, kids are vulnerable in that way.
Well, you mentioned the family members can also suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Family members that were not present at the event, even
Yes.
how does that happen?
Well, that's one of the things that I've seen often in the veterans that I work with. Oftentimes, spouses and other family members are very loyal and stick by their veterans in order to try to help them. And oftentimes the family member will begin to develop some of the same post-traumatic stress symptoms that the individual who has it in the first place
Just
was
being in
showing.
contact with them.
Yeah, that's reading an interesting article not long ago. It was titled "Secondhand PTSD," just as if you have secondhand smoke problems, secondhand PTSD, by merely being in proximity to someone who has post-traumatic stress disorder and it's not been treated, where it lingers on for months and months or possibly years and years. Oftentimes a family member can end up with post-traumatic stress disorder by being around the individual who has it. Or in other instances, people who have loved ones who have been hurt, who have been traumatized, sometimes they will develop it just because they're dwelling so much on what has happened to their loved ones. So.
Well, my sister disappeared like 12 years ago, and I don't know if it's actually PTSD, but I have just some anxiety about some things that may or may not have happened, because you don't know what may have happened to her. So your mind starts to think about the bad scenarios, and
that's undoubtedly in your own life you have been experiencing some of those patterns that we were just talking about. And again, that's not abnormal at all. Anyone who is in that situation would likely respond in the same way.
Well, when does PTSD first occur? When do the symptoms first begin to show themselves?
Well, in terms of a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, only when the symptoms are showing up at least 1 month after a traumatic event do you use the term post-traumatic stress disorder. In the first 4 weeks in the aftermath of a traumatic event, you don't talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, you just talk about a stress reaction that's happening in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event.
The death of a loved one, for instance.
Death of a loved one, or automobile accident that leaves one anxious, having difficulty sleeping or whatever. For the first month, that's not called post-traumatic stress disorder. It's just called an anxiety reaction, stress reaction, or an anxiety reaction. If the symptoms persist beyond 1 month, then one begins to use the label post-traumatic stress disorder. And oftentimes with post-traumatic stress disorder, the symptoms will not begin to surface sometimes for years. Some of the veterans that we're treating now, it's a period of many years before the symptoms actually start showing up, and that's why the term post is used, post-traumatic. It's in the aftermath of the event, but only when the symptoms persist beyond 1 month are we talking about post-traumatic stress disorder. Prior to that, it's just an anxiety reaction in the immediate aftermath of whatever the event was. So it has to be longer than a month.
How do you deal with that when it comes to children, when you don't even really know especially in abusive situations, how long it's been going on, to know when to diagnose them with that and how to begin treatment for them.
Well, with youngsters, you always have to develop an appropriate level of trust. So you begin by just talking to a youngster, and sometimes you do have them do some drawings, and you play with hand muppets and what have you, and try to just win a youngster's confidence. And then you begin to try to tease out just what's going on here. Is this a one-time sort of thing? Or has somebody frightened you at school, or has a dog bitten you, one-time sort of thing? Or have there been things going on at home or going on at school for a period of many months? You just have to get a youngster to open up and begin to tell you about what's going on. Some of the youngsters come in and they're talkative, and they'll tell you more quickly and more readily than an adult what's going on. But more often than not, it's the other way. Youngsters are hesitant and oftentimes shy, especially around a stranger, around a doctor, and you have to win their confidence. So you gradually work up to that.
We have some of the statistics. We're going to take a break here in just a few minutes and show the audience some of the statistics. But one that you sent me was that 10% of the U.S. population will develop PTSD.
Yes, that's correct.
In some form or fashion. Like you said, with me, it may be some signs and symptoms of that just by the anxiety that I have about what happened to my sister.
Yes. People who are really watching this area of life as far as PTSD are talking about we have essentially a national health problem that so many people are susceptible to this happening to them, that it's that the federal bureaucracy and healthcare providers need to be aware of the dimensions involved here. That 10% of the U.S. population, which is now hovering at what, 250 million people, we're talking about a substantial number of people at any given time, 25 million or thereabouts. That's a lot of people.
There's a lot of people.
And the toll that takes on the individual who has the problem and everyone else in that person's life is just, it can just be staggering.
Not to mention the fact that 10% is probably very conservative, because they're, especially older people, may be more hesitant to come forward, and with the things that they're experiencing, they think it's just something that you have to live with.
Yes.
And it's just the way things are.
Well, and that's been the experience I've had in working with the veterans population. The fellows that served in Vietnam, because they grew up in the era when they grew up, where the things were more psychologically minded at that point, were much more likely to begin coming in to try to get help. The guys who served in Korea and World War II were initially more hesitant, but thankfully those guys have finally realized that, look, we've got some of this going on with us too. And even though when we grew up it was a taboo to talk about problems with your nerves, because that was associated with being weak or being crazy or whatever, those guys are now realizing that's not what's going on here, and I'm going to go get myself some help also. But that was it took a while for that to happen with the older veteran population, and I think likewise with other American adults, as you say.
Is that what they think it is? It's just their nerves? They just think there's something wrong with their nerves, that they can't handle things going on around them?
More often than not, people are perplexed and are frustrated with themselves. What's the matter with me? I can't even handle my nerves, and I'm edgy. I can't sleep. I'm too irritable. Certain sounds and certain other events are causing me to have thoughts and feelings that I don't understand. It's just it's a sense of being perplexed and being confused. And most people, after they've had a chance to begin to talk about this and are reassured that, look, you've got something, we know what this is. You have a problem here, and we know what it is, and there is help available. Most people have an immense sense of relief.
Just putting a name to it.
Putting a name to it. And most people then react with a sense of frustration. I wish I would have, people who have waited a long time, say, I wish I would have done this long before now. I've been fighting this for, some people have been fighting it for years, and they finally come in and say, why did I wait so long? Well, it's just the way things are. And that's why talking about this on a program such as we are today, or going out to the schools, an effort to try to educate everybody that, look, this is something that can be dealt with, and don't let this bother you and cause problems longer than it needs to.
Well, we're going to take a break here in just a minute, and we're going to talk about, we're going to get more into the symptoms and the treatment for PTSD. We have, in the next segment, after we come back and talk with you for a few more moments, we have two veterans who have come and want to share their stories and their experiences with post-traumatic stress disorder, and how your experiences and your job at the Federal Vet Center are helping them to cope with that.
Yes.
We're going to take a break, and we're going to leave you again with those statistics that we talked about how post-traumatic stress disorder is more prevalent than we know. And we'll be back in just a minute or so with Dr. Williams to talk more about post-traumatic stress disorder. Stay with us.
Someday, I'll be a ballerina, just like them. And this will be my stage, where I twirl and float and swirl. Someday, this won't just be my wish. Someday, I won't be sick.
Welcome back to the program. We're talking again with Dr. Gordon Williams, a psychologist here in town and the contact provider for the Federal Vet Center. And Dr. Williams, excuse me, you reminded me at the break that while we talked about the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder in layman's terms, that there is a technical definition for it.
Yes.
And so if you can just, up on the screen, there'll be the definition that you can just kind of
Okay.
give us a little bit more technical.
Yes, technically, post-traumatic stress disorder, as the graphic shows, it's an anxiety disorder that can develop after exposure to any type of terrifying event which threatens grave physical harm to the individual. So the diagnostic and statistical manual that we use in the mental health field lists PTSD as one of the anxiety disorders.
And it can be anything, as we talked about before the break, as simple as, for a child, a dog bite, being robbed.
Yes.
Your home being robbed, to the bigger things that we know of.
Yeah. And automobile accidents. Mm-hmm. We have a number of people come in the aftermath of automobile accidents who have these PTSD symptoms. Mm-hmm. So, what are the symptoms? Well, there's a group or a cluster of symptoms that we typically look for as far as making the diagnosis of PTSD. Once again, on the screen, the graphics, symptoms that we call re-experiencing symptoms were essentially what we're talking about, symptoms that indicate that the individual is once again being flooded by thoughts or feelings that are similar to the thoughts or feelings that they had at the time that the traumatic event occurred. Intrusive recollections, can't stop thinking about whatever it is. I can still see the automobile coming at me just before it hit, or I can just see somebody coming at me before they pulled my purse away, and I can't stop thinking about it. Traumatic nightmares, not only not being able to stop thinking about it in one's waking time, but also dreams about whatever the traumatic event was. That particular symptom, traumatic nightmares, is probably the most typical symptom. Mm-hmm. Somebody in the office not long ago who ended up working the site at 9/11 in New York City, and individual is continuing to have significant problems with nightmares. Nightmares about things falling and being on top of one, and those kinds of nightmares. flashbacks. A flashback in the sense of one momentarily is caught up in whatever the event was and re-experiences it even though it's not happening. Some of the fellows that I work with who fought in Vietnam, at times they will momentarily be back. I've had people in the office who've gone into a flashback, and for that moment they were in Southeast Asia, and it's 35 years ago, and they could see things and hear things and smell things as if they were sitting out in the jungle. And that's a very frightening experience, to lose one's normal consciousness in that way and to go into that type of a stage for a few moments. But it happens. I've seen it happen. Trauma-related stimuli evoking psychological distress. What we're talking about there is sights and sounds that may cause one to remember whatever it was at the traumatic event, whatever the traumatic event was.
Smells.
For many veterans, thunder and lightning will be a reminder of artillery during their military experiences. Or some people who have been in automobile accidents, the sound of a siren will call them to recall what it was like laying there in the aftermath of an accident before the ambulance arrived. So different sounds that can evoke memories. Trauma-related stimuli evoke physiological reactions, heart palpitations, profuse sweating that's similar to what one experienced in one's bodily reaction at the time of the trauma.
And it just comes upon them.
People come in the office all the time who have had nightmares about whatever the trauma was, and they'll say, when I got up out of bed, the sheets were soaked. And so profuse sweating, night sweats oftentimes will occur, and daytime sweating will occur if somebody starts being overcome by memories of traumatic events. And it can be upsetting. Somebody's sitting in the work setting, or somebody's sitting in a classroom, and that starts happening. It can be very uncomfortable and awkward.
Which adds to the anxiety involved, that
Exactly.
everybody's watching, everybody can see me.
That's exactly what happens. It could snowball, and that oftentimes will lead people to come in and get help. They'll say, I can't put up with this anymore. I don't know what's going on with my body. But those are the kind of things that are happening in terms of what those graphics are about. So those are vivid re-experiencing symptoms that occur. Then on the other hand, you have just the opposite, avoidant or numbing type of symptoms. The mind can deal with trauma in one or two ways. It can be overwhelmed by the trauma in terms of the symptoms I was talking about a moment ago, or it can try to put the lid on those things that were traumatic, and that can lead to these other symptoms that we have shown on the screen. Efforts to avoid trauma-related thoughts and feelings. Some people come in and say, I'm making every effort that I possibly can to keep the lid on this, but so much so that I can't concentrate or I can't pay attention. So it drains off one's energy because one is trying to keep the lid on all of this so it won't bother one. So that's one way of trying to deal with it. Efforts to avoid trauma-related activities, places, and people. Some people who've been traumatized, such as in an automobile accident, they won't get in a car. And some people, their livelihood depends on some salesmen I've worked with who have been in automobile accidents. They can't get in a car anymore, and their jobs are in jeopardy. Their bosses are saying, you've got to be able to get out on the route, and they say, I cannot get back in an automobile. So you've got to work on trying to break down those types of that type of withdrawal from those things that are reminders of the trauma.
And for someone who doesn't have PTSD, you would almost, I don't understand.
Yeah.
I don't understand how come you cannot get back in the car. What is wrong with you?
Let me give you the most vivid example I've ever seen of that, and it's sad, and in a sense there's a kind of an ironic humor in it. One of the Vietnam vets who I was working with, he was from the Chicago area, and he had been in the 173rd Airborne in Vietnam, and in a fateful incident they were trying to cross a stream, and they were ambushed, and they were helpless out there in the stream. He survived, but many of his fellow soldiers didn't in the water. He gets back home, he's up in Chicago. He and his buddies and all their girlfriends go to Lake Michigan one day. Beautiful sunny day, they've got the coolers and all, the war's over. Everybody gets to the beach and jumps in the water, and he freezes at the water's edge. and all the guys are making fun of him. The girls start making fun of him, and he's frozen. He cannot get in the water, and he didn't understand why. He walks away, gets in his car and drives home, and 20 years later, in a therapy session, the light bulb goes on in his head. That's why I couldn't get in the Lake Michigan water. Somewhere in my mind, I was thinking about that incident where we got shot in that lake, or there was a river.
So it was all really locked in his subconscious mind, because he could not make the connection at that time
Not
at all.
Not at all. And it stayed there for many years. So he was trying to avoid water and didn't understand why. And his friends, I'm sure they meant no harm, but they thought he was just being a coward because thought the water was too cold in Lake Michigan, and that was not it at all. So that's a real life example of that particular stress.
And some of the others were?
Psychogenic amnesia. Some people have just total amnesia. They have no conscious recall whatsoever of what happened, and you really have to dig in order to try to get to that type of information.
You hear that happening with children more often than not, children who were abused as very young, and then years later,
yes,
they had no memory at all.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, all these things start to happen and flood back, and they don't even remember the event happening.
Yeah, I've had that happen in the office several times this week, where people were flooded by memories like that, where the lid had been on, and as they began to talk about it, it just all popped out, and it just can be amazing to see that happen. But
so there's no recollection at all, and all of a sudden it happens.
It just pops out.
That, to me, that's like being it all happening again for the very first time.
Well, the vividness with which people experience all of that when it comes back out, it's just amazing. Some of the World War II veterans that I work with, some of those fellows have really kept a lid on things, and when they begin to talk about some of those events that happened 55 years ago, it's as if it happened yesterday. And those guys have had to carry that burden with them all those years of trying to hold that in.
They're so sad to me.
Very difficult. So those are some of the additional symptoms as far as the avoidant numbing. And then there's another group of symptoms as far as the sorts of things that happen with hypervigilance. One is so attuned to anything that might indicate that something's going wrong, and insomnia, sleeping disturbance. That's one of the hallmarks of PTSD, sleeping disturbance, irritability, difficulty concentrating, the hypervigilance that I've just mentioned, and then exaggerated startle response. An example of that occurred in this very studio a number of years ago when some of us were here and we were filming a show about Vietnam, and one of your all's overhead lights went out, and all of the veterans momentarily disappeared from the set. That was an exaggerated startle response to the
And even after years later, it was just all of a sudden they did not want to be in this room anymore.
That's exactly what happened. And loud noises, fireworks, and what have you, did not settle well with the veteran population and their PTSD.
Well, what are some of the treatments? How do you combat this?
Well, there's basically, just to simplify a thing, there's two approaches that can be taken, and a seasoned clinician has to know when to use which. There's the approach of digging into the problem and trying to evoke it, to get it out, and that certainly oftentimes has to be done. But then for other people, it's just not time it's like doing surgery. Sometimes it's just not time to do the surgery. Things are just it's just too intense. And for those types of folks, you just do a very supporting, comforting therapy for a while. You teach them relaxation techniques, how to have calming, pleasant thoughts, and maybe eventually, when they're ready, you try to get to the let's dig in and talk about this. And when you dig in and talk about it, you walk a person through the traumatic events. What did you think? What did you feel? What did you experience? Well, we're going to walk you through this again, but in this safe environment of the therapy room. And it's very intense to go through that, and it's difficult work, but it's oftentimes what has to be done. in order to eventually erase these symptoms. But you've got to be very careful. As a clinician, you have to be very careful. If you immediately try to wade in before someone is ready for that, you can cause them to seal over even more. They don't come back, and they're left out there. I've seen that happen. I've seen that happen with several rape victims, where a well-intended clinician thought, you've got to talk about this right now and get it out of your system, and people were not quite ready for that, and they were never seen again. So you've got to know when is it time to dig in, and when is it time to just be supportive, and let's just keep things the way they are for the time being, and let you get your psychological breath.
So that's a very tough job. Because unlike a medical doctor, sometimes the symptoms are there, and you can see when someone is healed. You can see when they're better, and it's very clear and very evident.
Yeah.
But when you're dealing with someone's mind and their emotions, it's very hard to tell which way to go.
Well, I tell everybody with a little sarcastic humor, next time around in life, I'm going to be a veterinarian. Because when the dog's not feeling well, its head is down. When it's feeling good, its tail wags. And with all due respect to all the wonderful veterinarians, they do wonderful work. But
we have none of those telltale signs, do we?
These kinds of issues, it can get pretty vague pretty quickly, but it's very interesting, and it's just fascinating the way the human mind works, and I'm constantly impressed by people's resiliency. It's just amazing, and some of the vets that we'll be talking to in a minute, I think the viewers will pick up on their resiliency and their courage and hanging in there and dealing with all of this. It's uplifting to me to work with people and to see how everybody responds to all of this.
Well, we're going to talk to the veterans that have come here today, and we're also going to talk about the second part of your job, the Federal Vet Center, and your services that you provide to them to help veterans of this area.
Okay.
We'll be back in just a minute to talk a little bit more about post-traumatic stress disorder with a couple of veterans that have come here to talk to us today.
More people than ever before are surviving cancer. Here's your chance to recognize those survivors and honor the memory of friends and loved ones. We invite the whole community to reach out and get your teams together for the celebration of life. Sign up today for the American Cancer Society's Relay for Life. For more information, call the American Cancer Society today.
Welcome back to the program. We're talking again about post-traumatic stress disorder, and joining us now we have Duward Hamilton, a World War II veteran who suffered actually and served in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. And we have Mike Swinford, who was in the Vietnam War and fought in the Tet Offensive, which I was just informed at the break, which was two of the biggest battles for the U.S. forces in the history of our military.
Public.
So I'd like to thank you both for coming. Thank you so much. We'll start with you, Duward. Let's talk a little bit about your service and how you first figured out you had post-traumatic stress disorder.
Well, I knew the first Christmas I was home in 1946. I lived at Mayfield. I went to Mayfield, and back then they could shoot firecrackers on the street, and they were throwing them under your feet. Well, I had no offense. I had to go home and go to bed. And it just shook me up so much as that noise was shooting firecrackers, and then just go on and on. realized that there's something was wrong with me physically. I didn't have any visible wounds. I was wounded. I was a long time in battle. 6 months I was on the front lines, and I did get wounded in my hand and in my face. I was in an explosion, and but I didn't have any visible wounds. I had a lot of invisible wounds. It was all inside, and I've had a terrible time with it.
That was your first. That was your first.
That was
idea.
the first time it really bothered me. I realized it.
Did you have any idea that it was because of the war, or was it just you didn't know?
I thought it was, but and then later I was trying to get a job, I took examination, and they called me in for interview. I passed the exam. It was a state job. I passed the exam, and well, they interviewed me, and they said, well, you're going to get the job, but you got to go to the interview. I mean, I'm not talking about physical, I'm just talking about talking to somebody. And said, you got to turn it down because you're not qualified. Well, paper showed I was qualified, but it was my post-stress trauma. I knew my nerves they automatically disqualified me for that job.
So they could tell outwardly that you were upset a lot of the time, and so you fought at the Battle of the Bulge, and I know that you got the Silver Star.
Yes, I did, and I had the Silver Star, and the day I got that was a little later battle. I didn't get it in the Bulge, but the battle of the Bulge. Well, so many years ago, the day I was in a foxhole in the Battle of the Bulge. That in January the 8th or 9th, day the 8th. January the 8th. We went in the foxholes December the 17th in '44, and I wasn't pulled out of the foxhole until January the 26th. '45, and I spent that entire time outside in a foxhole. There was no fire. There was a lot of things that I know, but you barely had something a little to drink, and I know water. I'm talking about that, and some man just talked to me later. He's like, how did you bathe up there? So we didn't bathe. But,
that was the least of our worries. Right. Well, we also have with us Mike Swinford, and you served in the Vietnam War.
That's correct.
And so how did it come about that you realized that you had post-traumatic stress disorder?
Everyone in my life and around me knew something was wrong except me. When I left Vietnam for approximately 17 years, I never uttered the word Vietnam. I didn't even remember being there. I knew I had been there, but I could not recollect anything that happened there. And it took some 25 years for the recollections of particular events to come out with Dr. Williams' help. And everyone around me was aware that I was having some really severe problems. I was angry. People would come up and touch you on the shoulder, and I'd turn around and just knock them down. My relationships with women were just terrible, my children. But I thought the world was wrong, and I was okay somehow. And I didn't put it together that Vietnam was causing all these problems. And as the saying goes, one day I just got sick and tired of being sick and tired, and I realized that something was wrong, that a normal human being does not go to bed at night and wake up screaming or wake up just bathed in hot sweat, or you don't go places and look to fight. I picked fights with people that I knew I couldn't beat. I was trying to purge the demons that were inside of me. I never went to Walmart or any of these places. I was very secluded. I didn't venture outside. I was very protective. I set up booby traps. I set up alarms. I wanted to kill. I wanted to kill myself. I went through these whole gamut of emotions and feelings, and it took a long time to even come to the realization that, hey, there's something terribly wrong and I need to get help.
So, unlike Duward, who knew almost immediately that these were symptoms from being in the war, you had done what you had said, Dr. Williams, maybe you were just avoided it all, and he was putting that lid on top of it, and so you had no idea that they were connected or related, that's how come you were feeling this way.
No, I couldn't understand. I knew I was angry at something, but I wasn't sure what it was. And I tried to blame the anger on other people. It's my wife's fault that I'm angry. It's the kid's fault that I can't go out in public. It's all these different things that I'm blaming instead of looking in the mirror and say, hey, it's my fault. And when it came to the forefront was when I grew up in Massac County, and I was at the courthouse one day and heard some old men talking about Vietnam. And one guy said to the other, he said, who was the 4 men from Massac County that died in Vietnam? And the other guy said, I don't remember. I know there was a couple, but I don't remember their names. I overheard that, and I got angry that no one remembered them because 3 of them were my friends. So I began to take a proactive look at Vietnam veteran issues, and I started to do something. And I began to raise money to build a memorial in Metropolis. I joined VVA, which is Vietnam Veterans of America. And as I began to take part in these Vietnam issues, then the symptoms really became clearer to me, and that's when I came to Dr. Williams and I said, I need help.
Right. And so, how does it affect you? Like you said, you couldn't go out in public. You couldn't do any of that. Were you that way, Duward? I mean, were you just totally trying to stay away from people?
Actually, I went out in public. I withdrew it from, well, just for example, there was I guess my girlfriend that when I went in service, I wasn't married. Now my wife's out here. Anyway, she's aware of this. I didn't know her at the time, but anyway, when I got home, I withdrew from her. She didn't get a Dear John letter, but there's something that happened to me that the girl that I thought the most of when I went to service, I never did date her after I got back. She sent for me to come see her, and I did go over and talk to her once, but I never did ask her for a date. I completely changed. Something had happened to me, and my thinking and everything.
So you just didn't want to be around anybody that was from before?
One from before. I just changed my association.
How about your family?
Well, they changed some. My brother and sister had married while I was away and moved out of the home, and of course I didn't withdraw from my mother and father. And I have another little brother and sister, but
right.
I made new friends. You might say mostly.
But you came from a time, and you too, Mike, when you didn't talk about this. You didn't do that. It was, you were supposed to keep it all inside, and you were the men. You were men, and you were that stereotype that everybody has or had about men not supposed to have these feelings and these emotions, and what do you do with them, and how do you?
Well, I think if someone had reached out to us when we came home from Vietnam and encouraged us to talk about it, it would have helped. But so many people, especially other veterans organizations and whatnot, they sort of looked at us like we were different somehow, that it wasn't a real war that we fought in. We didn't use real guns. I've been told that a dozen times. You all use some kind of funny gun, you know, and we were not encouraged. And I went down to one of the local service organizations when I first got home, and I was just about laughed out of there. So I think that contributed to the alienation of wanting to stay away from even other veterans. And a lot of that still continues today. Not that particular aspect of it. I'm a proud member of several organizations now. But our peers, it was so confusing to everyone that we weren't encouraged to discuss anything. And when we did try to, we were laughed at a lot of times, and with the social climate being like it was back then, there was no motive to even do anything other than run away and hide, and that's what a lot of us did.
because a lot of people here at home in the States were protesting and saying that we shouldn't be there, and even some of the veterans that had come home were protesting and saying that. So when you did come home, you were kind of an outcast.
We were, and in some cases we still are.
And see, to me, that's just such a shame. And luckily, now you guys are talking about it, and it's more acceptable, more socially acceptable to talk to people like Dr. Williams.
And
but
along the lines of what Mike is talking about, and Duward also, well, a major effort is being made at this point to make sure that this next group of young veterans and their families don't end up having to walk down that same road of ending up feeling alienated and feeling like nobody understands. Efforts are being made as we speak to deal with people down at Fort Campbell, to prepare those families for the return of their young warriors, and to make sure that everybody is very watchful for the very types of signs and symptoms that these guys are talking about, so that they won't end up with the same delayed long-term types of difficulties that these guys have dealt with. So,
was post-traumatic stress disorder a disorder when the veterans from World War II and the Vietnam War, was it even known?
No, post-traumatic stress disorder became an official diagnosis only in 1980, and then the diagnosis has been clarified again in the mid-1990s. But when Duward came back home, they talked about war neurosis or combat fatigue in World War II. World War I, they talked about shell shock. So there was, in Civil War, they used the term nostalgia. During the Civil War, many people fought for both the Union and the Confederacy. Many of those people had post-traumatic stress disorder, and they would put them on trains and send them home. And they said these people are suffering from nostalgia. The same symptoms that we've been talking about today, those young soldiers had that. They would put them on, and the guys would get off the trains at the wrong places, and some of them never got back home, and all that's been swept under the rug. Nobody wants to talk about that, but there was, until 1980, this whole concept was very poorly understood.
Because I think that's almost funny, nostalgia. When I think about being nostalgic, I think about happy memories and going down memory lane and everything being happy and thinking about those good things, and that's not at all how it was for them.
Those people had a blank stare on their face, and unknowing others then said, well, they're just thinking about things, and they're nostalgic for being home. They're just homesick.
Because they fought brother against brother, father against son, and they had other issues dealing with that as well.
Yep.
Let's talk about the Federal Vet Center. How are you involved with that, and how does that help people like Duward and Mike?
Well, very briefly, Federal Vet Center, that did not come online until around the time that the PTSD diagnosis became official. In the late 1970s, influential people in Washington began to realize that many Vietnam veterans and their families were struggling, and struggling mightily with problems related to the war. Because of the nature of the conflictual Vietnam War, where there was so much disagreement and confusion, many veterans did not want to go to a VA hospital. They were distrusting of the VA. They equated the VA with the same government that had sent young people to Southeast Asia to that very conflicted war. So a decision was made, let's try to set up a separate federal program that will parallel the VA, but it'll actually be separate. And we won't have these big VA hospitals. It'll be like more little mental health centers that are closer to where people live. And that's what the Federal Vet Center is. It consists of 175 fully staffed vet centers, the nearest one to here being in Evansville. And then the people in Evansville are responsible for Southern Illinois, Western Kentucky, Northwest Tennessee, as well as Indiana. They don't have enough staff to do what the job they need to do, so I'm an outreach office for the Federal Vet Center in Evansville, and there's 425 of us around the country that we fill in the gaps where the vet centers can't reach. So rightfully so, Korean and World War II veterans began to say, we want to use these facilities also. Initially, only Vietnam veterans and their families could use these facilities. So they've expanded the program to where people from all the different wars can come in. And we've had people from Korea, World War II, Bosnia, Persian Gulf, all of the different conflicts are coming.
And now
in.
Iraq. You will be set up to help the soldiers coming back from Iraq.
We're already getting feedback from Iraq that be prepared. The incidence of people having problems over there is it's significant, very significant, and they're concerned. And we're dealing with people down at Fort Campbell now, trying to get prepared for all of that, trying to get the families prepared. The on-site counselors at Fort Campbell will be prepared when the soldiers come in, and all of us are going to do what we can to assist those families. We don't want these young families to go through what we went through, where Duward and his wife for years are struggling with all of this without knowing what's going on. Mike and his wife and family. No veteran should have to go through that.
You have to prepare, like you said, the families as well. Because the wives, like you said, Duward, when you came back, you weren't married at the time, but you were a different person when you came back. And so these wives and husbands now in Iraq are sending their loved, or they're, watching their loved ones go over there, and this person, when they leave and when they come back, they're a different person. And so do they get the counseling as well? How do you help the families in preparation for when they do come home?
Well, with the families of the Iraq and Afghanistan soldiers, we're sitting down with them and talking about the very things that we're talking about now. These are the signs and symptoms. Talk to this veteran and his wife. This is what they've been through. And be very careful not to automatically assume that this is not going to happen to you. It may well happen to you. Just because you're a professional soldier, just because you're well trained, you're still human. And these kinds of things can happen. So you forewarn people. These are the things to be on the lookout for, as far as those symptoms that we talked about earlier in this show. And as long as everybody is forewarned, that's what needs to happen. None of these veterans and their families were forewarned. And I tell everybody the ultimate ambush was waiting for them. When they got out of their combat zone, there was one ambush that was still waiting and nobody knew. It was a mental health ambush that was lurking inside. And what an irony. So we're going to try to ensure that these young warriors and their families don't face that same problem.
That's wonderful. How has your life changed since you realized what was going on and got the help that you needed, Duward?
Well, of course, I got the help with this later. We didn't. I remember they called me over to the VA hospital, and I was talking at Marion, and I told them about that's what Dr. Williams said. I call all preachers doctors sometimes. I get reversed, call it Dr. or Reverend. But,
a little of both, probably.
But anyway, I went to Marion, and they talked to me in mental health and said, you're having some problems? I said, yeah. And we had talking about flashbacks, and we always associated. I said, all the flashbacks that I'd heard that people had in the world were connected with those Vietnam veterans. Because I had a son, and 2 son-in-laws were in the Vietnam War too. But I hadn't heard of any World War II veterans having flashbacks. I knew I was having them, and I said, well, I guess I flash a little further back than they did. Many years further. Anyway, that was. And then I've been helped a lot now. I mean, it's like we're going through this period of Belgian Bulls now. It lasted a while. A little while ago, it lasted about 6 weeks, and as history says, it's one of the most horrible battles ever fought by mankind. I was right in the middle of it. I've had nightmares over that, but so far I was going to relate to Dr. Williams next time. That I made it to the Belgian Bulls. Is almost over now. I mean, back years ago, it was almost over at home, and thankfully, I haven't had a nightmare in this period of Belgian Bulls lately.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. How about you, Mike?
Well, my life has changed. I'm not even the same person that I was. I still have problems. I still have a bunker in my house. It says Dad's bunker on it. But I've recently remarried. This is the first relationship I've ever been involved in that I feel somewhat like a normal human being. Gone is the anger, although I'm sure it's still there somewhat. I went to Lowe's today, which was, for a lot of people, it wouldn't be a big deal, but for me, it was good to be able to not be afraid and not watch my back. And I'm very optimistic because Dr. Williams has helped me remember. I know now why I was angry. I know now why I have bad eyes and my hearing is gone. I understand the concept of physical and also mental pain and suffering that has been caused. And since I've met Dr. Williams and I've been a part of the Vet Center program, my life has changed. All of that isn't due to Dr. Williams, lest he get the big head, but I have had a great spiritual renewal in my life, and a combination of those factors has I enjoy life now. I enjoy having the children, and I have enjoying doing a lot of things that for 25 years I could not do and would not do. And so it's been a blessing. It's good to be able to go to sleep, and most nights I sleep uneventfully. There are still times when the flashbacks, the nightmares, the dreams will sneak up on you. The severity is not great as it was. The duration is very short as compared to what it used to be. And with the dawning of the morning, it brings about a new sense of optimism that Dr. Williams has helped me to instill, and I feel like a human being for the first time in 30 years.
Now you have the tools that you need to combat the war that you brought home with you. And I thanked you at the break, but I do want to thank both of you and all the veterans for the service that you have given to this country. We wouldn't be where we are today if it weren't for you. We're going to leave you with the phone number for the Federal Vet Center and some websites for veterans, and a website if you are not a veteran and you do need some help with post-traumatic stress disorder, because we talked about it's not just veterans. It's anyone from a small event to a large event that it can happen to you, and you need the help to combat what's going on inside of you and to be able to live a normal, healthy life and to work through that. We thank you for joining us, and I thank you for all that you've done, and I thank you for watching. Join us next time on Healthy Living.